The first hint that my new neighborhood, Oak Ridge Heights, was an HOA-controlled nightmare didn't come from the 37-page rulebook slipped under my door like a passive-aggressive welcome mat. Nor was it the snarky email about my unsightly accessibility ramp, a basic aluminum necessity, not some garish neon sign screaming property value destroyer, since I moved in during 2025. No, the real wake-up call hit during my first community meeting, when HOA President Helen Fairbanks stood up, her smile as stiff as a courtroom deposition, and announced a new bylaw banning excessive structural modifications like ramps and railings to preserve the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. Then she turned to me, Max Carter, and said, "I trust you understand," her voice dripping with condescension as the room fell silent, 25 homeowners and one confused guy named Doug, who I later learned was only there for the free cookies, starring in awkward anticipation. I'm not one to stay quiet when someone tries to erase my existence for their suburban utopia, but I was too busy debating whether to laugh or prep for a legal showdown. Helen, in her crackling pantsuit and perfectly coiffed hair, wasn't just hinting I was a blight. She was declaring it outright, like I'd rolled in and ruined her pristine vision of Oak Ridge Heights. She gestured to a projector screen flashing a deranged PowerPoint slide. Maintaining community excellence, removing barriers to beauty, and I cleared my throat, pointing out that I needed the ramp to, live. Her smile didn't budge, but her eyes gleamed with rehearsed venom as she cooed. "Oh, Max, dear, this isn't about singling anyone out. It's about consistency, uniformity, upholding the cohesive appearance of the neighborhood," while Doug, mid-cookie, whispered, "What does cohesive mean?" A question I ignored as I locked onto Helen's sanctimonious grin. She chuckled, a sitcom villain about to off someone off-screen, saying, "I wouldn't call it ugly, but Oak Ridge Heights has a reputation to maintain. Prospective buyers have complained about visual disruptions," waving vaguely in my direction like I was a weed in her manicured lawn. I let out a sharp laugh. "So my existence is a visual disruption now." And she sighed, feigning patience. "Certain modifications make the neighborhood appear unkempt," clearly meaning my ramp, before clasping her hands and announcing a vote open to the board and attendees. I scanned the room, hopping for a shred of decency, but Mrs. Delaney, a 70-something busybody who spied on neighbors through her blinds, nodded like this was genius, while others shifted uncomfortably yet stayed mute. Doug, finally catching on, stared at Helen like she'd sprouted horns. I exhaled. "Let's say I humor this insanity. What's next, banning wheelchairs?" "Should I hop to the mailbox?" And Helen's glee peaked. "Oh, don't be dramatic," prompting my retort. "Right, you're the victims here, terrified of a ramp." A murmur rippled through as her smile flickered, my first glimpse of her faltering, but she recovered, calling the vote. Hands shot up, too many, and my stomach twisted as I raised mine in opposition, Doug half raising his before chickening out, leaving the motion to pass unanimously with Helen beaming like she'd won a congressional seat. As Helen Fairbanks basked in her unanimous victory, I leaned forward, elbows on the table, and said, "Just so we're clear, you all voted to discriminate against disabled residents. That's a bold legal strategy," watching her expression flicker for a split second before she masked it with that dictator smile. While the room's silence grew heavier, 25 homeowners suddenly aware they'd stepped into something messy. I added, "Don't look so worried. I'm sure the local news will love this," and pulled out my phone, dialing loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hi, yes, I'd like to report housing discrimination. The Oak Ridge Heights HOA just banned accessibility ramps for disabled residents. Yes, I can provide statements. No, I'm not joking." As Helen's face drained of color and Doug whispered, "Oh, she's screwed," sparking a ripple of nervous whispers I didn't stick around to decipher. I grabbed my bag, nodded at Doug, who flashed a shaky thumbs up, and wheeled out of that meeting like an action hero, leaving an explosion, feeling the snap inside me settle into resolve. These neighbors I was supposed to wave at while they walked their dogs had just erased my right to navigate my own home, and I wasn't about to let it slide. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing, reporters already sniffing out the story, and I knew Helen had no clue what was coming. Less than 24 hours later, a news van rolled up, its logo gleaming like they were busting a government scandal, and Vanessa Cruz, a reporter with crime doc intensity, hopped out, already directing her cameraman. Wide shot of the ramp, B-roll of the neighborhood, get the HOA sign, Max, right? Ready to make some homeowners squirm. And I grinned, born ready. We set up on my porch, my unsightly ramp in full view, and Vanessa dove in. So, Max, what happened at that meeting? I unloaded everything. Helen's crusade against accessibility, the unanimous vote, how my existence was an aesthetic crime, her fake politeness and unhinged PowerPoint, while the cameraman zoomed in on my face and the pristine neighborhood backdrop, oblivious to its impending infamy. Vanessa nodded like she was plotting an award-winning exposé, then hit me with, "Why do you think they're really doing this?" And I leaned back. "It's not about the ramp, it's control. They want to decide who belongs, and pushing me out keeps their perfect little bubble pristine, uniform, free of anyone who doesn't fit their outdated, desirable mold." Her face hardening as she scribbled notes, the story already taking shape. The interview aired that night, and by morning, Oak Ridge Heights was an internet punching bag. HOA website flooded with complaints, comment sections raging with unbelievable discrimination. And this is why HOAs suck. Someone digging up Helen's old Facebook post crowing about being the queen of order, birthing memes of her in a dictator's uniform captioned, "First they came for the ramps and I said nothing." I thought Helen might try a forced apology, but she doubled down, sending a neighborhood email dripping with faux calm. "Dear residents, we're aware of the misleading, defamatory news report. Rest assured, the HOA remains committed to Oak Ridge Heights' beauty and order. This bylaw isn't targeting individuals but upholding standards that make us desirable. Trust you'll see through the sensationalism. Sincerely, Helen Fairbanks." And I was still laughing when my sister Emily called, battle-ready after watching the segment, asking, "Next step, legal action?" And I said, "Already on it, but let's see how bad this gets first." The fallout from Helen's tone-deaf email was swift and brutal. The news station ran a follow-up story the next day, this time with footage from the HOA meeting, courtesy of Doug, my accidental ally, who'd secretly recorded the whole fiasco, and in a stroke of chaotic genius, sent it to Vanessa Cruz without fully grasping the dynamite he'd handed over. The video was a gut punch. Helen dismissing my concerns with that smug, cohesive appearance line, the unanimous vote looking less like a formality and more like a dystopian purge, her PowerPoint slide flashing its Orwellian, removing barriers to beauty, nonsense. Every frame screamed discrimination, and the internet ate it up, piling on with fresh outrage as Helen's dictator memes evolved into full-on supervillain edits. Doug called me an hour after the story broke, his voice a mix of pride and panic. "Hey, so I think I did something." And I couldn't stop laughing. "Doug, you accidentally blew up the HOA?" To which he replied, "Cool, are they gonna sue me?" And I assured him they'd have to be insane to try, knowing Helen wasn't about to back down. She'd fight and she'd go down swinging. That night, she called an emergency HOA meeting, and I rolled in, ready for the meltdown. Helen wasn't smiling this time, packing the room, clutching a folder like it was her last shred of sanity, and the second she saw me, she snapped. "You had no right to involve the media," her voice a hiss, to which I shot back. "I had every right, and it's only getting worse for you," watching her eye twitch as she declared. "The board decided your actions violate community harmony." Prompting my incredulous laugh, "Community harmony? Helen, the internet, named you villain of the month. You don't have harmony, you have a PR crisis." She ignored me, turning to the sparse crowd, most residents now eyeing her like a train wreck they didn't want to touch, and barked, "We need to control the narrative." The board's proposing immediate enforcement of the bylaw, including removal of non-compliant structures, met with stunned silence until Doug, bless him, raised his hand. Helen, wouldn't that be illegal?" Her glare could have melted steel as she spat. "It's not illegal to enforce community standards." And I cut in. "It is when they're discriminatory," making her slam her folder down with an "enough." Before announcing, "The board will vote on whether Max Carter has violated the terms of community living." I whistled. "You're voting on whether I can live here." "Easiest lawsuit of my life," as Doug whispered to the guy next to him. "She's making it worse." And before Helen could retort, the door swung open. 3 suits walked in, the lead woman flashing a legal badge, glancing at me. "Max Carter?" I nodded. Then at Helen, "We need to talk about the Fair Housing Act," shifting the room's air like a guillotine dropping. Helen's mouth opened, then shut. I grinned. "You should have just let me keep the ramp." as chaos erupted. Helen stormed out, the board whispered like rats on a sinking ship, and Doug stared like he'd seen an exorcism, while I rolled out knowing Helen had finally lost the reins, and nothing was saving her now. The next morning, the Attorney General's office launched an investigation into Oak Ridge Heights, digging into the HOA's records and finding a goldmine of sketchy practices. Helen's smug confidence had built a house of cards, and it was collapsing fast. The Attorney General's investigation hit Oak Ridge Heights like a wrecking ball. By morning, the HOA was officially under scrutiny, those 3 suits from the meeting tearing through records with surgical precision, uncovering not just the ramp ban's blatant violation of housing laws but a pattern of shady moves. Quietly denied accessibility requests, suspiciously targeted fines, a trail of bureaucratic landmines Helen had laid with her own hands, now exploding under her feet. I barely had to lift a finger. The news tracked every twist. The internet turned Helen's face into a meme parade. HOA dictator loses kingdom, and SS Fairbanks, sinking ship edits popping up everywhere, her silence enforced by a frantic legal team only fueling the fire as the world shredded her in her absence. Doug, my unwitting partner in crime, swung by with soda and popcorn, plopping into a porch chair like we were watching a blockbuster, cracking a can and sighing. "Dude, this is better than TV," as I scrolled through my phone, laughing. "It really is. Check this, someone found old HOA newsletters where Helen wrote a whole, preserving the aesthetic section, just a list of stuff she hates. No basketball hoops, no non-neutral doors, no flags except approved seasonal decor. No lawn ornaments like big gnomes, prompting Doug's bewildered. "What did the gnomes do?" "Disrupted the visual harmony, apparently," I said, and he shook his head. "She's got too much time on her hands." While we marveled at the disaster unfolding, the HOA board, once Helen's loyal puppets, scrambling for cover as the investigation widened. Realizing it wasn't just the ramp ban under fire, but their entire enforcement history. Board members bylaid like rats from a flood, resigning with flimsy excuses about family time or vanishing without a word. By week's end, only Helen and a shell-shocked Ted remained, the rest pretending they never backed her, their self-preservation kicking in too late to dodge the fallout. Helen, undeterred, called another emergency meeting, her last stand, and I rolled in to witness the carnage. She wasn't packing now, just furious, pointing at me the second I arrived. "This is your fault," to which I replied. "You banned ramps, Helen, you did this." Her ignoring me to rally the thinning crowd. "We need to stand together. This is our community, we won't be bullied by outside forces," as Doug whispered. "Is she talking about the government?" I shrugged. "Think so," while she ranted. "We have the right to govern ourselves, protect property values, maintain Oak Ridge Heights' prestige. If we let people like Max dictate rules, what's next? Cars on lawns, loud music all night. This is about order." Ted, her last ally, coughed. "Helen, I think." But she cut him off. "No, I won't be silenced. I've kept this neighborhood pristine for years. I won't let it be ruined." Then, in a twist no one saw coming, Mrs. Delaney, the blinds-peaking ramp band cheerleader, stood, adjusted her cardigan, and said, "Helen, dear, you've become a liability," freezing the room as Helen blinked. "Excuse me." Mrs. Delaney sighed. "The press is destroying us. Property values are dropping. My sister saw our HOA on a comedy show last night. It's time to move on." And murmurs of agreement rippled through, even Ted muttering, "It's best if you step down," leaving Helen speechless, her years of control. Over lawns, mailboxes, everything, crumbling in days, the most satisfying implosion I'd ever seen, her kingdom toppling as the crowd turned, and I sat back, knowing the end was close. Helen's reign unraveled faster than a cheap sweater after Mrs. Delaney's betrayal. The room's murmurs swelled into a chorus of dissent. Residents who'd once cowered under her iron fist now openly nodding. "We need new leadership," as Ted, her final board ally, slumped in defeat, muttering, "It's over, Helen," while she stood there, mouth agape, no retort left in her arsenal, her years of dictating Oak Ridge Heights, every blade of grass slipping away in a single glorious mutiny. 2 days later, she resigned, the Attorney General's office having already slammed the HOA with a formal reprimand. The ramp ban was discriminatory, unenforceable, scrapped entirely, and new accessibility policies were mandated, along with a hefty fine and an order to cover my legal fees, a sweet bonus I hadn't even chased, the whole mess collapsing under its own weight as Helen's smug empire turned to dust. The new HOA election rolled around the next week, and in a plot twist no one predicted, Doug, cookie-loving, accidental whistleblower Doug, got voted in as president, running half as a joke until residents, desperate for anyone not a control freak, rallied behind him. His first act was an email that read, "Hey everyone, let's just try to be chill, okay?" The sanest HOA rule ever written, a breath of fresh air after Helen's reign of terror. As for her, she sold her house and vanished without a goodbye, rumors swirling she'd resurfaced in another HOA-controlled neighborhood a few towns over. Poor souls, I thought. They've got no idea what's coming. While Oak Ridge Heights limped on, my ramp staying put, my home finally mine without the neighborhood Gestapo breathing down my neck. The internet moved on to its next outrage, but every so often someone clocked me from the news asking, "You're that guy who took down the HOA, right?" Smile. Yeah. Savoring the memory of Helen's downfall, a saga that started with a 37-page rulebook and ended with her legacy in tatters, all because she couldn't stomach a ramp. Back at the emergency meeting, though the air had been electric, Helen's "you've become a liability" moment wasn't just a crack. It was the dam breaking, years of her nitpicking, banning gnomes, neutral-only doors, seasonal flags, boomeranging back as residents realized the press firestorm, the dropping property values. The late-night comedy jabs weren't my doing but hers, her obsession with order torching the very prestige she'd claimed to protect. I'd watched her face as it sank in, that dictator smile gone, replaced by a deer-in-headlight stare. The woman who'd once ruled with PowerPoint slides and bylaws, now a pariah. Her own neighbors turning like a tide she couldn't control. And me just sitting there, ramp and all, the catalyst she'd never seen coming. Doug had leaned over mid-chaos, whispering, "She's toast," and I'd nodded, knowing the Attorney General's suits had her dead to rights. Those landmines she'd planted in the HOA's records were hers alone, and they'd blown up spectacularly, leaving her no spin, no defense, just a resignation letter and a for sale sign. The fine, the fees, the new rules were just gravy. The real win was watching her lose everything she'd built. Her pristine condition, fantasy shredded by the very community she'd lorded over. And I got to roll away from it all, unscathed, victorious. A guy with a ramp who'd accidentally sparked a revolution. With Helen gone and Doug at the helm, Oak Ridge Heights exhaled. His "let's be chill" email set the tone. A stark pivot from the suffocating bylaws that had once banned everything from gnomes to ramps. And for the first time since I'd moved in, the neighborhood felt less like a prison yard and more like a place people actually lived. My ramp no longer a battleground, but just part of the scenery. The Attorney General's ruling had cemented it. The HOA's fine stung, my legal fees got covered, and new accessibility rules locked in my right to stay. A tidy victory wrapped up without me lifting more than a phone to call the news that first night. Helen's downfall was her own doing, her control freak fingerprints all over those damning records, and I got to watch it burn from the front row, popcorn optional. Doug, now president by default, took to the role with a shrug and a grin, showing up at my place after his election with more soda, saying, "I figured I'd just tell people to relax, seems to be working." And I laughed. "You're already better than Helen," scrolling through the fatting online frenzy. Her dictator memes still lingered, but the spotlight had shifted, leaving Oak Ridge Heights to lick its wounds and me to settle into a quieter life, though the occasional stranger still flagged me down. "You're the ramp guy, right?" And I'd nod, "That's me," a badge I wore with zero regret. Helen's exit left a void, sure, but it was a relief. Her house sold fast, whispers of her popping up in another HOA hellscape far off, probably already drafting a new aesthetic integrity manifesto, and I pitied whoever got stuck under her thumb next, knowing she'd never learn. Rewinding to that last meeting, though, her collapse was poetry. Mrs. Delaney's liability jab had landed like a sucker punch, and Helen's stunned "excuse me" couldn't stop the tide. Years of her micromanaging, mailbox heights, neutral doors, no loud music, had bred resentment, and the press storm she'd sparked with that ramp ban turned it into rebellion. Residents waking up to the fact her prestige, obsession was tanking their property values, not mine. I'd sat there, ramp intact, as she floundered, Ted's, "Step down, please," sealing her fate, her silence deafening after years of barking orders. The woman who'd ruled with an iron PowerPoint slide, now a ghost in her own kingdom, toppled by a roomful of neighbors she'd underestimated. And me, the guy she'd pegged as a visual disruption, just watching her unravel. Doug, she's toast, whisper had been spot on. The Attorney General's suits didn't even need my help. Her own paper trail did her in, every sketchy fine and denied request a nail in her coffin. And when she resigned, it wasn't surrender, it was survival, her for sale sign the white flag she'd never wave. The new rules, the fine, Doug's chill reign. It all fell into place after that. A clean slate I hadn't even had to fight for beyond that first call to Vanessa Cruz. And I rolled through it all unscathed, the accidental hero of a neighborhood that didn't know it needed saving until Helen pushed too far. Her legacy. A cautionary tale, a meme, a sold house, and me still here ramp and all, proof you don't mess with a guy who knows how to dial the news. Life in Oak Ridge Heights post-Helen was almost surreal. Doug's let's be chill philosophy stuck, and the HOA morphed from a petty tyranny into a bare-bones operation. No more 37-page rulebooks or bans on ramps, gnomes, or anything else that dared disrupt Helen's precious visual harmony. My ramp now just another fixture, not a war zone, blending into a neighborhood finally free to breathe. The Attorney General's hammer had done its job. The fine hit hard, my legal fees were paid, and those new accessibility rules weren't just a win for me but a shield for anyone else who might roll into this suburban maze, all thanks to Helen's own overreach. Her landmines of denied requests and targeted fines had blown up in her face, and I'd barely had to nudge the dominoes, that first call to Vanessa Cruz enough to send it all crashing down. Doug, still reeling from his accidental presidency, kept things light, dropping by with, "People keep asking me about lawn rules, I just say, do whatever, just don't burn it down." And I'd laugh, "You're a natural." While the internet's Helen obsession faded, her dictator memes replaced by fresher scandals, though every now and then someone spot me, grocery store, gas station, grinning, "You're the HOA guy?" And I'd nod, "Yup," a quiet pride in toppling her reign without breaking a sweat. Helen herself? Gone, house sold, rumors of her terrorizing some new HOA a few towns over, probably already measuring mailboxes, and I couldn't help but smirk, thinking, good luck to them, knowing she'd left Oak Ridge Heights a humbled shell, her prestige, a punchline. Flashback to that final meeting, though, it was a masterclass in collapse. Mrs. Delaney's liability line wasn't just a quip, it was the match that lit the fuse, Helen's "excuse me." Drowned by years of pent-up gripes, neutral doors, no flags, her suffocating order. And the press chaos she'd ignited flipped the script. Residents seeing her ramp and tank their property values, not mine, her control slipping as Ted's step down landed the killing blow. I'd watched, ramp and all, as she stood there, speechless, her PowerPoint tyranny crumbling, the neighbors she'd ruled with an iron fist turning on her. And me, the disruption she'd tried to erase, just sitting pretty while she imploded. Doug's "She's Toast," the perfect soundtrack to her stunned exit, the Attorney General's suit sealing it with a paper trail she couldn't outrun. That resignation wasn't grace. It was defeat, her for sale sign the last gasp of a dictator who'd misread her kingdom, and the aftermath, fines, new rules, Doug's reign, fell into place like clockwork, a victory I hadn't even had to chase, just sparked with one phone call and a grin. Helen's legacy was a warning now, a memed-up cautionary tale of overreach, while I stayed put, ramp intact, proof you don't mess with a guy who knows when to dial the news and let the world do the rest. Oak Ridge Heights survived, quieter, humbler, and I got to live in it, not fight it. A home at last, not a battlefield. Doug's chill vibe stuck, the HOA a shadow of its former self, and every so often I'd catch a neighbor's wave. No tension, just a nod. Knowing we'd all dodged Helen's bullet, her shadow gone, her rules dust, and me still here, rolling on. Oak Ridge Heights settled into a new normal after Helen's exit. Doug's "let's be chill" mantra holding strong, the HOA a ghost of its former self. No more ramp wars, no more gnome bans, just a quiet suburb where my accessibility ramp stood unthreatened. A silent monument to the chaos that had remade it. The Attorney General's ruling a lock on my peace. Their fine and fee coverage a bonus I'd never dreamed of when I dialed Vanessa Cruz that first night. Doug kept the gig low-key, swinging by with, "People like the no-rules thing. Someone put up a flamingo lawn ornament and I just waved." And I'd grin, "You're rewriting history." While the internet's Helen fixation fizzled out, her dictator memes buried under newer dramas, though I'd still get the occasional, "You're the ramp guy, right?" At the mailbox or store nodding, "That's me." A legacy I carried light as a feather. Helen, meanwhile, was a phantom, her house long sold. Whispers placing her in some distant HOA nightmare, probably terrorizing new neighbors with her aesthetic integrity shtick, and I'd chuckle. They'll figure her out, knowing Oak Ridge Heights had, in the end, survived her, humbled but intact. The victory wasn't just mine. It was the neighborhood's, a place I could finally call home without dodging bylaws or glares, her reign a faded echo. My ramp proof you can fight petty tyrants and win with one well-timed call and a little grit. Looking back, that last meeting was the climax. Mrs. Delaney's liability bomb, Helen's stunned "excuse me." Swallowed by years of resentment over her neutral door decrees and flag bans, the press firestorm she'd lit with that ramp vote flipping the script. Her prestige, crashing property values while I sat there, ramp untouched, watching her unravel as Ted's step down finished her off. Doug, she's toast, had nailed it. The Attorney General's suits didn't need my push. Her own records sank her, every petty fine and denied request a self-inflicted wound, her resignation a forced retreat, that for sale sign her final bow, and the aftermath, fines, new rules, Doug's chill takeover, landed like clockwork. A win I'd sparked but barely had to steer, just rode out with a grin as her empire burned. Helen's legacy. A memed-up warning, a sold house, a lesson in overreach. While I stayed, ramp and all, the guy who toppled her without breaking a sweat, proof you don't mess with someone who knows how to play the game and let the world swing the bat. Oak Ridge Heights healed, quieter, freer, and I got to live in it, not fight it, waving back at neighbors who'd once voted me out, now just folks sharing a street. The story faded from headlines, but its mark lingered. Every so often, someone'd ask, "You took down an HOA." And I'd smile, "Yeah," savoring how it started with a 37-page rulebook and ended with Helen gone, Doug in charge, and me rolling through a neighborhood that learned the hard way. Control freaks lose when you shine a light on them. And I'd done just that, one call at a time, turning a ramp into a revolution, then settling back to enjoy the peace it bought. A home at last, no battles left to fight, just a life to live, ramp and all, in a place that finally figured out chill beats order every time.